Welcome to Module 3 of CRA Certificate. Module 3 is entitled Study Documentation. The third learning outcome of Module 3 is to explain source documentation in clinical trials. The content of the third learning outcome covers on the definition of source data and source document, nature of source document, purpose of source document, principles of good documentation practice in source documentation, source document what-if situations, common quality issues related to source document, and application to CRA practices related to source documentation and source documents. According to ICH-GCP, source data is described as all clinical trial information, which includes original records and certified records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical trial necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of the clinical trial. Source data are contained in source documents, which can be original records or certified copies. What is source document? Source document is a document in which data collected for a clinical trial is first recorded. They are original documents, data and records at pharmacies, at laboratories, and at medical technical departments involved in clinical trial. For example, inpatient medical records, outpatient medical records, trial-specific visit source records, such as worksheets and checklists. Some detailed examples are hospital medical records, clinical and office charts, clinical laboratory record, memorandum, subject diaries, medical evaluation checklists, pharmacist dispensing records, recorded data from automated instruments, copies or transcriptions certified after verification as being accurate copies, photographic negatives, microfilm or magnetic media, and even radiology images are part of source document. These data are usually later transcribed into the case report form. Traditionally, case report forms are in paper format. With the advancement of technology, the industry has been employed electronic case report form to capture the clinical data into the clinical database. Source data written on the source document should be consistent with the data entries in the case report form. The nature of source documents can be paper and/or electronic records. Paper source document format is handwritten clinical data on pre-printed forms prepared in advance, printed medical records with original handwritten investigator signature or site personnel signature. Electronic source document is a collection of patient and population health information in a digital format electronically. It is a combination of text, graphics, data, audio, pictorial, or other information that is created, modified, maintained, archived, retrieved, or distributed by a computer system. Electronic medical records are also alternatively known as electronic health records. Electronic medical record is commonly employed at current times, for example, in Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Europe. Here is an example of a source worksheet created for clinical trial. It should not be an exact copy of the case report form. The source worksheet generally includes trial information, instructional data fields, which are empty fields or spaces for completion, and there will be yes or no options for the site personnel to complete. The source worksheet will generally capture the sequence of trial procedures which prompt site personnel to complete. It will also specify measurement units that needs to be included in the source data. Certainly, for every sheet of your source worksheet, there should be a version control date and a version document number. For any source worksheet which is completed by any site personnel, it should be completed either with a signature or an initial of the responsible person. Last but not least, the source worksheet should include paginations so that we know for the entire trial how many pages are there for every subject. Here is another example of a source worksheet where it can be in a tabulated table form, alright, and it will still comprise of the generally included items in any source worksheet. For example, the investigator review sign-off, visit dates, measurement units. What I would like to highlight is that there's no standard way of creating a source worksheet. As long as the content and the information stands relevant to the clinical trial and it is reconstructible for audit trail and the data is reliable and valid, it can be used to support as a source worksheet in a clinical trial. The design of the source worksheet is certainly subject to the individual creativity at the individual clinical sites. As long as this information captured in the source worksheet is in reference to the protocol requirements and the needs of the case report form, to enable an independent party to understand the clinical trial subject's development or progress upon participation in the trial and upon exit of a trial. In the reality world, the scope of the clinical trial source documentation should include at minimum trial information such as trial identification, subject identifier, date of visit schedule, initial and re-consent, informed consent process and date, subject eligibility, performed protocol required procedures, trial drug administration, records of your adverse events, concomitant medications, reason for clinical trial withdrawal by the subject, and trial completion. Occasionally, some source data may be entered directly into the case report form without the need of a source worksheet. For example, subject reported questionnaire. The purpose of the source worksheet is to collect clinical trial data for transfer to case report form, whether it is paper or electronic, into the clinical trial database and translated into the clinical study report. This guides the trial site, for example, the research nurse, on the scope of the clinical trial data especially for your efficacy and your safety data endpoints to be collected to support the clinical trial objectives. The other purpose of the source document is to provide an audit trail between the original source document and the clinical database. This allows an independent observer to make a reconstruction of the clinical trial before the subject enters the clinical trial, during the clinical trial, and after the clinical trial of the trial procedures such as subject consenting, subject eligibility, safety reporting processes, and accountability of investigational medicinal product. Sometimes to ensure that the consistency of the document or the record is used to record every clinical data point, the sponsor or the contract research organization will work with the investigator to agree on the nature of the source documents or the original source records that will be used for a clinical trial at the start of the trial. This will help to ease the source data reference. Such agreement is known as the source data plan or source data agreement in the industry practice. It is subject to the company document naming convention. Here is an example of a simple template of a source data agreement. Certainly, the source data agreement will contain more than one page. It depends on how extensive the clinical trial design or the trial expectation is. Here are some examples that are of the ICH GCP requirements abstracted from the GCP standards. Source data and source documents can be located in the sections related to the ICH GCP principles, ICH GCP investigator related sections, as well as the ICH GCP sponsor related section. I shall leave this slide a little longer for you to have some time to read the GCP requirements related to source data and source document. This slide is showing the GCP standards in regards to the sponsor responsibility for source data and source document. Here are some additional terms associated with source data and source document, which is commonly employed in the clinical research industry. They are confidentiality, prevention of disclosure to other authorized individuals of a sponsor's proprietary information or of a subject's identity, case report form, a printed, optical, or electronic document designed to record all of the protocol required information to be reported to the sponsor on each trial subject, trial documentation, or records in any form, including but not limited to written, electronic, magnetic, and optical records, and scans, x-rays, and electrocardiograms that describe or record the methods, conduct, and or results of a trial, that factors affecting a trial and the actions taken. Essential documents are documents which individually and collectively permit evaluation of the conduct of a trial and the quality of the data produced. Let's have a knowledge check session. Which of the following describes source data and source documentation? You may try to select more than one option and The answer shall be provided in the next slide. I hope all of you have the correct answer. The answer is accurate reconstruction because it will allow you to provide an audit trail of how the clinical trial was conducted in the sequence of the procedures. Medical records are normally used to capture source data. Original entry, the first entry, is our source data. Now, to achieve proper source documentation, the principles of good documentation practices should be employed by all clinical trial personnel in a clinical trial. The key attributes for good documentation practice were first described by the United States Food and Drug Administration in the form of the LCOA principles. These principles are also adopted by the World Health Organization. European Medicines Agency has added some more letters to describe qualities of good source documentation, particularly for electronic documentation. Here is the list of the good documentation principles. Let's first understand the definition of the individual principles. The acronym of good documentation practice is ALCOA: attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. Without proper source documentation, there will be a lack of reliability, lack of accuracy, and missing clinical data on the source record. Let's look at the first principle, attributable. It needs to show the responsible person who made the documentation and who performed the procedure. Legible, the documentation must be readable to an independent reviewer and the signature is identifiable. Contemporaneous needs the clinical data that is recorded at the time of activity. If it's not possible, the chronological order of events should be recorded. An acceptable amount of delay should be defined and justified. For example, if the informed consent is performed and obtained from the subject today, then the source documentation related to informed consent process should be documented today and not the next day or the following day. What we are trying to explain here is that the documentation of every performed activity should be timely. Original means the first entry record made by the responsible person. Sometimes it may be a certified copy instead of the original first entry. Another principle of good documentation practice is accurate. The clinical data is consistent with real representation. It must also be enduring, where the written records will not fade off, so the inks of the data needs to be long-lasting and durable. Available when needed, which means that the source document must be easily retrievable and accessible in a reasonable time for review, especially in audits and inspection. You cannot tell the CRA or your auditor or your inspector that the medical records can only be provided 1 week later. Complete all information till a specific time point. All the information must have completeness, and it must be consistent to demonstrate the required attributes consistently. All the data provided in your source document must be of a reliable, factual, and accurate information, and the data must be of supported to confirm by evidence. It cannot be data that does not have evidence, then it will not be reliable. Let's have a knowledge check. Please list the good documentation principles based on the following acronym. The answer shall be provided in the next slide. A, L, C, O, R. A stands for? I hope you have got the correct answer. Yes, it stands for attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. The next question. The research nurse obtained blood pressure reading on the 3rd of February 2020, but it was recorded on the medical records on the 5th of February. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. I hope you have the correct answer. Yes, it is contemporaneous. Now, what are some of the documents associated with source data and source documentation? You can find them in particular to the requirements in ICH GCP E6R2. You can also find the operating procedures of your sponsor or your CRO organization related to source data and source document. You can also find requirements of source data and source documents from your local or your national regulatory requirements and or regulations. Certainly, you can also find in your clinical trial specific documents such as your clinical monitoring plan. Sometimes unexpected circumstances or challenges can be faced in source data and source documentation. They are, for example, you will be able to notice that there are a lot of photocopies of medical records, especially the historical medical records. So what is important here is, as a site personnel or even as a CRA, you need to make sure that a copy, irrespective of the type of media used of the original record that has been verified, they must be dated with a signature or by generation through a validated process to have the same information, including data that describes the context, content, and structure as the original. And this definition of certified copy can be found in your ICH GCP R2 section 1.63. What I would like to highlight here is, as long as photocopies of medical records are being obtained from the subject or from the investigator or any site personnel, it must be certified copy. The other aspect is the electronic medical records assessment that some CRAs or investigators may feel or experience the challenge. Where can you find information related to electronic medical records requirements? You can find it from the 21 CFR Part 11, Electronic Records, Electronic Signature, Guidance for Industry Part 11, Electronic Records, Electronic Signatures, Scope and Application, Guidance for Industry, Computerized Systems Used in Clinical Investigations, as well as Electronic Source Data in Clinical Investigations. I have provided a copy of all these guidance or guidelines, which you may read at your own time in details on the electronic medical records source assessment. Now, in simple, I would just like to highlight using this slide what are the key elements that you may want to look into or assess or understand of electronic medical records assessment. Whether you are a CRA or you are an investigator, you will need to first identify what is the name of the system, and when it was being implemented, the system installation, training, maintenance, update or upgrade records or frequency. You also want to understand the medical records data in the system. What is the scope of information in this medical record system, and how are the data being backed up as well as tested with standard operating procedures? What is the data retention procedures and duration for this system? Does every individual user account have a unique password and identifier? You cannot share them among different individuals. User account, is it automatically logged off after a specific duration of inactivity by the system? Sometimes it's good to also understand whether does the system have an audit trail, which is made when the information is made or changed in the system, that you will be able to identify from the audit trail who has made the entry at what time and what data has been corrected and who made the correction. You also need to assess whether does the system use electronic signature, and does the electronic signature include any password applied for intentional or unintentional misuse. As a CRA, you need to have access to the system restricted only to the trial subjects, but not the entire hospital's patients' medical records. It is good as a CRA to check on your company's standard operating procedure on the assessment requirements and acceptability of electronic health or medical records. As a clinical investigator site, as an investigator, or even as a site personnel, you may want to contact the relevant functional department in the hospital to understand the electronic medical record system so that you can make the relevant assessment whether the system is CFR Part 11 compliant. If the medical record system is not CFR Part 11 compliant, then the medical records will need to be printed out and signed and dated by the investigator throughout the clinical trial duration. Now let's have a knowledge check session. A trial subject came to the clinical investigator site with his surgical related to hemorrhoidectomy, which was performed before enrollment to the colon clinical trial. As part of the clinical trial requirement, it requires documentation of the trial subject medical condition to confirm his eligibility. The study nurse made a photocopy of the trial subject's hemorrhoidectomy surgical records with no further actions undertaken. The study nurse informs the CRA the photocopy hemorrhoidectomy surgical records is a certified copy obtained from the subject. As a CRA, would you consider the photocopy of the hemorrhoidectomy surgical records can be regarded as a source record? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. I hope you have the correct answer. It is no. It is not acceptable to be a source record because the study nurse did not make further actions upon receipt of the photocopy of the trial subject's hemorrhoidectomy surgical records. There was no sufficient evidence to show that these surgical records are indeed certified copy. What are some of the common quality issues that could be identified as a CRA? Related to source data and source document. In terms of source data, as a CRA, you will often notice that the source data is not collected as the procedure or the trial activity was not performed. Sometimes the source data recorded on the source record did not match or was not consistent with the data captured or entered in the clinical database, which means is that if the blood pressure reading of 120/80 is being written on the source record, but in the ECRF it is written as 110/20. So you will find that the source data between the source record and the ECRF do not match. You will also notice that there is duplicate of source data in multiple source records, and this is also not acceptable. Sometimes you will find ambiguous source data, and this can also lead you to consider whether the source data is reliable and valid. In terms of source document, you will notice that the source data is not recorded on the source records by the site personnel after the trial procedure, which means is that the data were not entered contemporaneously. Source records, example personal diary or original entry, are not maintained in the clinical trial files by the site personnel. The clinical trial data are transcribed from the original source record into the medical records by the site personnel. There are times corrected source data are not initialed and dated by the site personnel with a reason for the changed information on the source record. Sometimes copies of medical records are not certified as true copies, and source records are not signed and dated by the responsible personnel. Given that you have received the knowledge of source data and source document, how would you transform this knowledge into the CRA practices at the different phases of the clinical trial management? At the time of site selection, it is good for you to understand whether the clinical investigator site has the capability to retain all your clinical trial records according to the regulation requirement of 15 years upon marketing approval received of the investigational medicinal product. And as a CRA, you also need to assess the medical record structure and the system at the clinical investigator site, whether they are paper or electronic records. If they are electronic records, you can then assess if they are CFR Part 11 compliant and how they should be managed for the clinical trial management in terms of study documents. If, as I explained earlier, if the medical record system for the electronic aspect is not CFR Part 11 compliant, at this stage you will need to inform the PI who will be potentially assigned for this trial of the expectation of the medical records documentation in terms of source documentation, so that they will be agreeable to the expectation. At the point of site initiation, similarly, you will need to reconfirm the medical record structure and what are the records or the systems that are used to capture your clinical source data and your source document. At this stage of site initiation as a CRA, January sponsor will also require the investigator to sign off the source document, agreement or plan to identify which document is used to capture which specific clinical data point. During the routine monitoring as a CRA, your main key role is to perform source data verification between the source document and your case report form. Whether your case report form is paper or electronic, it needs to be consistent with your source document. It is at this time that you will need to identify that the investigator has provided all the relevant source documents or records in an accurate, complete, timely, legible, and dated with identification of the clinical trial. You will also need to check for the accuracy and the completeness of your case report form entries, and certainly if there are any discrepancy between the source document and the case report form, as a CRA, you should ensure that appropriate actions, additions, or deletions are made, dated, and explained. Certainly, it needs to be initialed by the investigator. Alright, and you also need to be able to verify all the source records and medical records are present in the clinical trial files at the time of trial closure. When you are performing source data verification, you should always exercise meticulous document review skills. Look for trendings, look for discrepancies, look for intentional acts of fraud. And you also need to observe the clinical investigator site work processes to assess whether it matches with the way the source document has been documented approach. As mentioned, the key function as a CRA in the monitoring aspect is source data verification. With this, we have completed the third learning outcome. In summary, source data is the foundation of your clinical trial results. They are clinical trial data endpoints that are essential to evaluate if the clinical trial objectives are met. Source document is an essential document to serve to collect reported clinical data endpoint. It is an evidence support of audit trail to allow reconstruction of the subject's journey in a clinical trial. Observance of good documentation principle provide an accurate source documentation supporting the fundamental principle of protecting subject rights, safety and well-being, and data integrity in accordance to the GCP standards. CRA is responsible to verify the reported clinical data in the source documents are accurate, credible, and consistent with the case report entries for transcribing into the clinical study report. What is not documented is not done. Document what is done as well as what is not done. This is the take-home message to everyone. With this, we have completed the last learning outcome of Module 3. Now, let's have a quiz time so that we can assess what we have learned from Module 3. Clinical trial protocol is a written non-essential document that describes how a clinical trial should be documented and addresses the clinical trial objectives. Is this statement true or false? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is false because clinical trial document protocol is an essential document. Which section of the ICH GCP standard describes the content required in a clinical trial protocol? Please provide the industry standards. The answer shall be provided in the next slide. It is ICH GCP E6 R2 Section 6. Clinical Trial Protocol Amendment Version 2 2nd of October 2018 was implemented on 1st of November 2018. The revised protocol was implemented without approval from the IRB or the Ethics Committee and the Regulatory Authority. The protocol was revised to clarify that vital signs should be obtained prior to dosing on page 10 of the protocol. It was not stated in the previous protocol version 1 and not consistent with the other sections in the protocol. Should the revised protocol be implemented before approval from the relevant authorized bodies? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is yes, because the revised protocol comprises of only administrative changes, such as the pagination. Thus, the amended protocol can be implemented and then subsequently informed to the ethics and the regulatory authorities immediately at the soonest. Which of the following are related to informed consent in GCP context? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. You may select more than one option. The answer is subject, voluntary willingness, verbal and written process, signed informed consent form. The trial drug of clinical trial protocol ABC has a porcine ingredient. Porcine is originated from pigs. Will this information require to be included in the informed consent form? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is yes. The ingredient may not be acceptable in certain cultural or religious practice in certain countries. This can be inconvenient to the subject, and this is based on ICH GCP E6 R2 section 4.8.10. As a CRA, you performed a monitoring site visit at Site 123 on 6th of May 2018. You reviewed the initial informed consent form version 3, 31st of January 2018, which was signed on 10th of February 2018. The Ethics Committee approval letter showed the informed consent form version 3, 31st of January 2018, was approved on the 3rd of March 2018. Is the informed consent process in compliance with the GCP requirements? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The correct answer is no, because an unapproved informed consent form was used by the site. Subject ABC came to the clinic to provide consent for clinical trial protocol XYZ. A copy of English informed consent form was provided to the subject to read by the study nurse. The subject communicated to the nurse in Mandarin that she is not able to read and write. She can only speak in Mandarin. In the consultation room, the investigator communicated the clinical trial to the subject in Mandarin. The informed consent form was signed in Mandarin between the investigator and the subject. Are all relevant representatives present for consenting? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is no, because the subject is illiterate. There should be an impartial witness present. Clinical Investigator Site 123 does not have a routine practice for subjects to come fasted when they visit the site. Subject ABC came to the investigator site to provide consent for clinical trial protocol XYZ. The signed informed consent form showed consent was obtained from the subject on 2nd of February 2018 at 12:30 hours. The medical records recorded by the study nurse showed the subject was fasted at 8:30 on the 1st of February 2018. Fasting is not a routine practice or procedure required by the hospital. Is the informed consent process in compliance with the GCP requirements? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is no. According to ICH GCP E6R2 section 4.8.8, informed consent should be obtained before study participation. The research nurse explained to the CRA that she normally records the blood pressure reading, body temperature readings, and reported adverse events on her personal diary first at every scheduled visit. These information are then transcribed to the medical records after the scheduled visit. Which document is a primary source document? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer should be A, personal diary, because personal diary was the first entry made for all the blood pressure readings and the other trial activities. Information transcribed on the medical records are considered as your secondary source document. The research nurse explained to the CRA that she normally records the blood pressure reading, body temperature readings, and reported adverse events on her personal diary first at every scheduled visit. These information are then transcribed to the medical records after the scheduled visit. Which document should the CRA use to perform source document review? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is C, A and B. As a CRA, you will need to check that the primary and the secondary source documents, together with the CRF, that all the data are consistent and accurate and complete. The research nurse documented the name of the concomitant medications on a loose paper at the clinic. She transcribed the concomitant medication onto the trial worksheet at the end of the scheduled visit. The loose paper was then discarded after the transcription. Is the handling of the source document correct by the research nurse? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is no. According to ICH GCP, the first entry was made on the loose paper, which is a primary source record. It should be attached with the trial worksheet for retention. It should not be discarded by the study nurse. Body temperature and blood pressure readings were printed on thermal paper. The imprints will fade over time and source original data will be lost. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. Yes, it is enduring because the data can be faded over time. In order to overcome this, normally the sites will make a photocopy of the blood pressure and the body temperature readings from the thermal paper, and the photocopied document will then be signed and dated by the investigator as certified true copy. Both the original and the certified true copy should be attached together into the subject's records. Medical records were repeatedly not provided to the CRA for review to confirm for subject eligibility during the monitoring visit. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is available and accessible. As mentioned, all medical or source records needs to be available and accessible for review regardless it is for the CRA, audits or even inspections. Subjects' historical radiology images 3 months prior to screening were not obtained from the subject to assess subject eligibility. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? Correct, corroborated, because you need to make sure that what is required by the protocol is performed. If they are not performed and you make the subject enter the study, then you are construing the subject's entry and clinical data reliability and validity. The blood pressure readings on the screening visit source records did not match the data entry made in the case report form. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. The answer is consistent because they do not match between the source record and the case report form. The investigator did not sign off for every source record made at every scheduled visit. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. Yes, it is attributable. As mentioned, whoever that documents on the source record or the medical records needs to sign and date to show who is the person who made the entry or even performed the trial procedure. Subject medical records stated the subject was not able in hands movement. The research nurse claimed that the subject completed the subject-reported questionnaire by themselves. Which principle of good documentation practice was not fulfilled? The answer shall be provided in the next slide. Yes, it is credible. If the subject's hands are not able to make any documentation, how can the subject complete a subject-reported questionnaire? This is where you will question the credibility of the data or the completion of the subject-reported questionnaire. We have successfully completed Module 3, and in summary, clinical trial protocol, informed consent form, and source document are essential trial documents in a clinical trial. The clinical trial protocol and informed consent form describes the requirements of how the clinical trial should be conducted and how the clinical data points should be collected to the clinical trial team and the subjects. The source document is a documented evidence to support or show how the clinical trial is actually conducted and how the clinical data points are collected by the trial site to demonstrate protocol compliance. These trial documents serve to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of the subjects participating in the clinical trial. It also supports the spirit of the ICH-GCP standard in achieving data integrity and data reliability. Understanding the application of these trial documents help the CRA to locate the protocol requirements effectively, to promptly identify protocol non-compliance, and to assess the adequacy of the trial conduct by the trial site. These are the references used to support the content of these training materials. Congratulations, you have successfully completed Module 3. With this, I thank you for your attendance.